everyone, and welcome to my channel. My name is Angie and welcome to video number 2 of Crimeoween. All this month we are examining true crime cases that occurred around Halloween. And in this video I do have another unsolved case for you, and this time we are going to New York to discuss the case of James Adamski. James Adamski was born on July 18th, 1964 to his parents Bernard and Rose Marie. And Bernard and Rose Marie actually had a total of 4 children: Larry, Susan, James, and Andy. Now, I was unable to verify the ages for Larry or Susan, but Andy was 10 years younger than James. And they would raise their children in the small town of Depew, New York. So as I mentioned, Andy was 10 years younger than James, and he adored his big brother. He idolized him, you know? He wanted to follow him wherever he went and just hang out with him as much as he could. And rather than shrug his brother off, James often made time for him, babysitting him when his parents wanted to get out of the house, or even putting him on the handles of his bicycle so the two could go around town together. But James's kindness wasn't just restricted to his family. He was a very friendly person and would give you the shirt off of his back just so you would have a shirt. Now, he loved art and bowling, and he just enjoyed spending time with his friends. You know, he was a typical teenager. With his long hair and winning personality, James was popular in high school. So when he and his friends heard about this Halloween party that a bar called 5 and 23 was hosting, they decided they were going to go check it out and enjoy the night drinking and dancing. So on October 30th of 1982, 18-year-old senior James Adamski would put on his American Gigolo costume and then say goodbye to his family. Now, his younger brother Andy was sitting in the living room waiting to go trick-or-treating, and James leaned over to kiss him on the head and told him to have a great time. And by all accounts, Andy did. But this would be the last Halloween that he would ever enjoy. So James sets off with his friends to go to the 5 and 23 bar on the corner of Transit Road and Walden Avenue in Depew, New York. That night, the 5 and 23 is actually hosting a Halloween special where you pay one flat price and can drink as much as you want. And the local teens plan to take full advantage of this. At this time in New York, the legal drinking age was 18 years old. So James and his friends arrive at the bar and they are drinking, dancing, having a great time, just embracing the spirit of Halloween. Now, we don't know what time James's friends left or if they asked if he wanted to come and he said, "No, I want to stay on and party." None of that was made clear, but James himself would actually leave the bar at 3:30 a.m. on October 31st, and he was just going to walk home. It was pretty much a straight shot down Transit Road, and it was less than 3 miles away. So also leaving the bar at the same time was a young woman who would accompany James for a little while. They actually split up once they reached the corner of Transit and Broadway, where she would turn off, and at the same corner, a police officer reported seeing James and talking to him. So this would lead me to believe that James was not heavily intoxicated, or the police officer would have remembered that fact or made a note of it, or, offered to give him a ride home. But either way, the police officer and James, finish their conversation, and James continues on his journey. But sadly, he would never make it home. Rose Marie stated that when James didn't return home, she immediately knew something happened. James was very respectful of his parents and would always let them know what his plans were. And his father even said that, his home life was good. He was a popular guy. He had absolutely no reason to vanish, but vanish is what he did. Police spent weeks searching the area, but they would find nothing. Now, keep this in mind because we are circling back to this in just 1 minute. So along with searching for James, the police were also conducting interviews. They talked to his friends, they talked to his ex-girlfriends, the people at the 5 and 23, along with the young woman that he walked with for that short distance. And by all accounts, James was a good kid. He wasn't a troublemaker. He didn't have any enemies, but they did get one slight possible lead from these interviews. So it turned out that night there was an argument between James and some people at the bar. Now, as investigators looked into this lead, they determined that it was more just a drunken altercation, nothing to be taken too seriously. However, they did want to speak with a few men that were reported leaving the bar shortly after James. With information dwindling and no sign of James, people in Depew began to lose hope that they would ever find out what happened to him. Thanksgiving came and went, as did Christmas, but the Adamski family had little to celebrate. On December 26th of 1982, rabbit hunters in Lancaster, New York, would make a grisly discovery. Just off of the quiet Ransom Road, they discovered the body of James Adamski. James had been placed in a shallow grave and was covered with leaves and freshly broken twigs and was still in his Halloween costume. His cause of death was determined to be blunt force trauma to the head, but a murder weapon could not be determined. Police thought it may have been a 2x4, a baseball bat, or a tire iron. Now, he did have at least a dozen severe blows on his forehead and the side of his skull. The area of Ransom Road where James was found was an underdeveloped area. There was a train track nearby, and brush and trees butted right up against the road. The Erie County District Attorney John Flynn stated that the individual who committed this crime knew exactly where to go. They knew it was a secluded spot, and the likelihood of discovery was minimal. James was found 4 miles from where he was last seen, and the police gathered the evidence at the Ransom Road location, including the freshly broken twigs. So they sent them off to a laboratory to determine if there were any fingerprints on them, but nothing could be determined. This really isn't all that surprising considering it was December in New York, so the killer would have likely been wearing gloves. The chief of police, Thomas Fowler, did share that there were details surrounding James's body that he could not disclose. And it's really not that surprising. Law enforcement typically holds a few details back from the public in case they are interviewing suspects or trying to determine if a lead is valid or not. False confessions are a very real thing here, people. After James was discovered, Rosemarie was not the same person. Angie said that she became highly overprotective of him. He wasn't allowed to take the school bus. She had to drive him to school for years, and he would always have to be home before the streetlights came on. She was scared that whoever had murdered James was going to come for Andy next. Both Bernard and Rosemarie would pass away without knowing what happened to James, with Bernard passing in 2000 and Rosemarie following in 2005. In 2016, the police sent all of the clothing that James was wearing that night out for DNA analysis, but nothing ever came back from that. Or if it did, it has never been disclosed. So a year later, the Lancaster Police Department, along with the Erie County DA, John Flynn, decided to bring some new light to the 35-year-old cold case. The police would offer a $10,000 reward for information leading to the arrest and indictment of the person or persons responsible for the murder of James Adamski. Crime Stoppers Buffalo would also add an additional $1,000 to the top of this. They felt, as I do, that James's case can be solved. Someone knows something, even if they think it's just a minor detail. They could have witnessed something at the 5 and 23 that night, or something on Transit Road, or they could know someone that they feel should have been interviewed that wasn't. Or maybe they were even involved with the murder and were just too scared to come forward. Law enforcement stated that James's case will remain open until they find the person responsible. And after they reopened his case in 2017, they received 2 fresh leads. But unfortunately, they would go nowhere. 38 years later, new investigative techniques and advances in forensic technology are being used to review the evidence, but James's case remains unsolved. So there are 2 theories about what could have happened to James in the early morning hours of October 31st. The first theory is that someone completely random just stumbled across James, saw this as a crime of opportunity, and decided to take his life. The second theory, and the one I believe is most likely, is that this was someone James knew, even if it was just through a casual acquaintance. I find it highly unlikely that someone happened upon an 18-year-old male in the prime of his life and decided to kill him. Yes, he could have been drunk, but to me, the evidence shows that he was not so heavily intoxicated where he should not have been walking by himself. Remember, he passed that police officer, and if he was just flat out wasted, surely the police officer would have said, "Hey, sit down, let's talk for a little bit," or "Can I drive you home?" That didn't happen. And even if he had been drinking that night, wouldn't this person fear him fighting back? Could this be the evidence that investigators are withholding from the public? Did James fight back? Did he have bloody knuckles? Also, whoever killed him concealed his body. If this were a random act, why would they have to do that? An unknown offender would not have to worry about being tied back to James. They didn't have to conceal him with the leaves and the twigs on Ransom Road, but they did. Why? And when was James taken to Ransom Road? While I don't doubt that weeks were spent searching for James, I'm curious as to how this search was conducted. Typically, the investigators will pick a central point and then work outward in a circular motion. And if this were the case, why was James not found? So I don't know what the term freshly broken twigs indicate, but when I first read that, I personally felt that James had been moved there sometime after Halloween, like it's sometime in December. James's body was in a state of decomposition, so obviously he had been out in the weather for a certain amount of time, but I'm not quite sure how long that was. So if he was moved at some point, where was he being kept before and why? Was the argument at the 5 and 23 more serious than law enforcement was led to believe, and someone knew that they had to do a really good job concealing James until the heat died down off of them? Or was this someone else entirely? Did someone at the party that night have a reason to be mad at James? We know that he suffered at least a dozen blows to his head, indicating possible overkill. Another reason that I believe the perpetrator knew and targeted James is because what happened after he left the bar. Remember, he was walking with the young woman until they reached Transit and Broadway when he spoke with the police officer. Let's say someone was following them or saw the two of them together. Wouldn't you think that an unknown assailant would go for a younger woman versus a younger man? Wouldn't she have been the easier target over him? Police did speculate that whatever happened to James happened between Broadway and Como Park Boulevard, and this is less than a mile down the road. It's not outside the realm of possibility that whoever did this saw the two of them together. So why did they choose to pursue James? Also, the wounds inflicted on James show that he was facing his assailant. This could show that he wasn't trying to flee the situation, but rather either attempting to fight back or reason with someone he knew, telling them to calm down, that they could work things out. So as I mentioned earlier, the police did want to speak to the men seen leaving the 5 and 23 shortly after James. This could have indicated a group attack, but to me, the evidence doesn't point this way at all. If this crime was committed by a group of people, I would expect to see further damage to James's body, especially to his back or the back of his neck and head. But none of that was reported. To this day, the murder of James Adamski remains unsolved, and investigators ask that anyone with possible information about the case contact the Lancaster Detective's Office at 716-683-2800, extension 137. I will leave that number linked in the description. And with that being said, we are at the end of another video. I want to know what you guys think happened to James. Was he murdered by someone he knew, or was this a random perpetrator? And if you like this video, please be sure to let me know by giving it a thumbs up and subscribing to my channel so you don't miss a Crimeoween video. And with that being said, I will see you guys in my next video. Bye!